Hello, my name is Matt Allen. I'm one of the creative technologists at Leeds 2023. In today's podcast, we're talking to FOXGLOVE about John Smeaton. So I thought it'd be a good idea for you to start by introducing yourself and letting us know why you're interested in this subject.
Hello, my name's Jane Earnshaw and I am one half of FOXGLOVE, and I also work for Leeds City Council as part of the Culture Programmes team.
And I'm Abby Smeaton. I'm the other half of FOXGLOVE, and I also work with Jane at the council as part of their culture programmes team, working on things like Leeds Inspired.
Thank you. Could you let me know how long you've been working together as FOXGLOVE?
I think officially 2019. See, I don't even know. We've been on this journey for so long, Matt, that it's hard to remember when it began. But it's been a fascinating journey that we've been on since the beginning. But I think we started this, maybe FOXGLOVE didn't start, but we started kind of working and exploring John Smeaton back when Leeds was bidding for Capital of Culture. So back in the day, I don't know when that was that 2018, 2017, Abby?
It was something like that, yeah. And I think really, I guess that's when our interest in lighthouses started, wasn't it? Kind of back in those early days of when Leeds was bidding to be Capital of Culture. And when we started researching lighthouses for a project, and that was where we stumbled across our friend John Smeaton and found out that he built the most iconic lighthouse in the world.
And a bunch of other stuff.
And a bunch of other stuff, yeah, and a bunch of other stuff. That was the next bit, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Had you heard of John Smeaton before you started this project, or was your research into lighthouses your first introduction to him?
I think, like probably most people in Leeds, our awareness of John Smeaton was up in East Leeds. There's or certainly was a school. I think there still is a school. I think it survived. The name survived. Academies, I think. So aware of it being a school and leisure centre, I think is probably what most people in the city would say if you stopped them in the street and said, "Who's John Smeaton?" They'd go, "Isn't that a school up in East Leeds or a leisure centre?" And I think that was where that was the limit really of our awareness. And then when we started researching lighthouses, and it was for a project that we were bidding, putting in as a proposal for the bid book to build a lighthouse in Leeds, as you do. We discovered John Smeaton built not only a lighthouse, well, he built two actually, but built the most famous lighthouse in the world. And that was when our journey with him began. And it's just gone on and on and on. It's like this incredible book that each time we turn a new page, we discover something else. And certainly for the first 12 months, Abby and I were just constantly sending each other messages going, "Did you know this? Did you know this?" And we'll share some of those with you throughout this podcast. But there's just, you won't believe it by the end. When we, talk to friends of ours and they go, "Oh, I want to tell you about John Smeaton," and you can see them glaze over, and understandably, but by the end, they're kind of going, "I can't believe it. I cannot believe this story isn't known." So that's the kind of journey that we're on, and we've just become absolute kind of fangirls for John Smeaton. So.
A project that Leeds 2023 is currently hosting is called Tech for the Public Good. It's bringing together people from across the world, including artists, researchers, academics, people from countries across the world, and asking them to work together to create something for the public good. With your knowledge of John Smeaton, I wondered just what you think about when I say, what does Tech for Public Good mean to you?
Well, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I think Tech for the Public Good is something that isn't, I suppose, when people imagine tech for the public good, they imagine something from the past 30 years, but actually it goes back much, much, much further than that. And I think we kind of look at it from a perspective of it's about innovation for the public good. And we kind of, as we were thinking about Tech for the Public Good, so I don't think we've said actually how old John Smeaton is in this podcast. So it's worth saying that John Smeaton was born in 1724. So that's a very, very long time ago, nearly 300 years ago. But he was at the forefront of the technology of his time, which was around engineering and kind of developing that whole kind of scientific practice. And when he was kind of at the heart of that kind of process of developing his practice as an engineer, one of the things that he did was he made the differentiation between engineering for the military, so military engineering, and engineering for the public good, and that was civil engineering. And I think it's that whole kind of ethos of being able to do something that is not for political gain, it is not for financial gain, it is literally for the good of the world around us, whether that's about the environment, whether that's about the people around us. And if we then fast forward nearly 300 years, then I think that when we talk about tech for the public good, you know, when you're thinking about Tim Berners-Lee and the invention of the internet, those things still ring true. It's about how we are creating things that are good for the world around us and good for the people around us. And I think that's about how that is done is really interesting as well, kind of in terms of that thing of sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, and also kind of being able to acknowledge what other people have done in the past as well.
Thank you. You touched on there a little bit of the history of John Smeaton. You mentioned when he was born. I wondered if you could just take a little bit of time and give us a brief history lesson of John Smeaton from your research.
Okay. So, John Smeaton, Leeds lad, born in East Leeds, in Osthorpe, which is kind of out towards Whitkirk Way and kind of out past Seacroft. And went to Leeds, that potted history, went to Leeds Grammar School from the age of 10 to 16, then left school at 16, and was largely then after that, he was self-taught. So, and he was, by the time he was 16, he'd already built his own workshop in his house, kind of in the gardens, and was doing his own experiments. And dad wanted John to be a lawyer. So John got packed off to London to go and kind of learn to be a good boy and learn to be a lawyer and kind of do well for the family. But whilst down there, John became great friends with an artist called Benjamin Wilson, who was also studying law. And they both quit to take up their passions. For Benjamin Wilson, that was science and art. And he became quite a prolific kind of portrait artist. And for John Smeaton, he went into instrument making and eventually the foundations of his career to be a civil engineer. So the important things about John Smeaton are, as Abby said earlier, he is the very first person to describe the profession of civil engineering. So kind of civil engineering started in the UK, started in Leeds. Now there's a title that we don't claim, kind of. And he built 2 lighthouses, the most famous lighthouse in the world, the Eddystone Light, which if you go into Waterstones, pick up any book on lighthouses, and I guarantee there will be a chapter on the Eddystone Light. It is that famous. So if you close your eyes and kind of imagine a lighthouse, and imagine that childhood lighthouse, and it probably had a beautiful sweeping curve to the tower. And that curve was designed by John Smeaton, inspired by nature, inspired by the oak trees of East Leeds. And the nature of the curve dissipated the winds, the wave actions, and it meant that the lighthouse didn't fall down. And the previous 2 had fallen down. There's a whole episode about that. Kind of, he built bridges, he built harbours, he built canals. He, as Abby said, he did most of his first work was on windmills and water wheels. So he built 6 windmills, 46 water wheels. He came up with equations about kinetic energy. He came up with the equation about friction and flight, which became known as the Smeaton coefficient, which was then used by the Wright brothers to fly. So Abby has a fantastic presentation called From Osthorpe to Outer Space, because John Smeaton is name checked on NASA's website. What else did he do? I think, Abby, you dug out something, wasn't he involved in the Beaufort scale, or kind of the predecessor to the Beaufort scale?
Yeah, so I think as with many kind of scientists, he built on the kind of work of other scientists as well. And so he did a whole thing around wind measurement. which was then taken on to inform the Beaufort scale. So there's loads and loads of examples where the work that he's done has then been taken and picked up by somebody else and then used to either fly or to measure, kind of
steam engines from Watt. He built the steam engines then, didn't he? That then Watt made super efficient. And what did Leeds do to celebrate him, Matt? Leeds named a flyover after him. But he built beer vaults as well, didn't he?
Yeah, his other claim to fame, which I just love this, and I feel like no one knows this, is that he actually stopped London Bridge from falling down. So it started collapsing apparently, as that bridge did at various times over the centuries, and I think it was just after he'd built the Eddystone Light, so it was when he'd started to become really famous, kind of for his kind of construction and design skills. And they sent for John Smeaton. I think he was working up in Scotland or somewhere at the time. So I've got this image of him, galloping down the country. This was before, everything was done on horseback. So it was before trains or anything. I've got this image of him kind of galloping down the country through to London and saving London Bridge from falling down. So he did all that, but he was also really modest. He was like, if you're gonna think about the archetypal Yorkshireman, that was our John. He was properly kind of called a spade a spade. He was really not interested in promoting himself as a personality. What he was interested in was his work, and he was interested in sharing his work and connecting his work with other people to make his work better. And I think every time when you think about tech for the public good, it's that kind of a ethos and that kind of a way of working that I think is very, very John Smeaton. One of the things I did yesterday, I was kind of thinking about open source kind of principles, and actually John Smeaton embodied all those principles of what open source is. So, he didn't patent any of his work. So when you think about that whole thing about tech for the public good, so his technology was building and construction and design. And if he wanted to, he could have patented everything that he invented, everything that he designed, and he could have made a shed load of money from that. He could have become so famous as a personality for inventing and kind of prototyping all this stuff. But he didn't do that. He was very much about sharing and about kind of being able to go, okay, right, I've done this. What can you do to make it better? Or he would very much be about acknowledging the work that had come before him. So when he talks about lighthouses, for instance, so he's written this amazing book, which is about how he built the Eddystone Lighthouse. It's incredible. It's in Leeds Central Library. It's a book that you would imagine the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk to own, because it's like a massive kind of oversized folio book. And some of the pictures of the lighthouse are so big that they have to be folded in and out of pages. In that first chapter of his book about the lighthouse, he references the lighthouses in Egypt. He references geographers who are kind of looking and researching in different countries in Africa. There's a whole load of work that he does there where he kind of really goes, I am doing this, but all of this other stuff came before me, which is just at the heart of open source. And also that thing about publishing as well. So he published his work constantly. And that's again about that kind of, I'm sharing this so that you can make it better, and being part of that kind of community of makers and designers. So he invented open source. Can I say that? Is that okay to say that?
Yeah. But he was a proper Yorkshireman. Apparently, he had a thick Yorkshire accent, and
made no apology for it.
Made no apology for his northern tones. And there's a lovely story about he was invited by a princess in Russia to go and live in Russia and work for Catherine the Great to build Kronstadt Harbour and a load of other works and work for the Empress, for Catherine the Great. And he wrote back to the princess kind of going, "Oh, you're all right, love. Thing is, I really love Yorkshire and I've got enough work on at the minute. So, basically, thanks for your offer of riches. But I'm going to stay here." and and there's this lovely reply from this princess kind of basically saying, kind of, well, I can, we can probably find another engineer to do this work, but we will struggle to find a man of your integrity, and that the Empress will be poorer for not having you on her team. And it's just kind of really lovely that he was kind of like, a celebrity engineer would have grabbed that kind of and ran into the arms of, fame and fortune. And he was a bit like, "You're all right. I'm quite happy in Leeds. I've got enough on, thanks."
Personally, as someone who lives in Leeds, I knew very little about John Smeaton until I started doing a bit of reading because I knew I was going to be meeting with you today. One of the things I was reading about is about concrete. Is it right that he invented concrete?
No, he's the inventor of making concrete set underwater, basically. So it was quite incredible. So the Eddystone Light is 14 miles out to sea. So it's not one of these nice lighthouses that is on a cliff top. You've got to sail 14 miles out to sea in horrific conditions to this lump of rocks, which all these ships have been scuppering themselves on. And of course, in bad weather and in certain tides, the rocks are underwater. So he was having to invent a way. So not only did he come up with the idea of dovetailing kind of the blocks together, so they fit together like jigsaw pieces, so they're kind of physically locked and can't just be kind of pushed apart. But he did experiments on making basically waterproof cement. And through his own recipes, he managed to come up with a cement that could set underwater. And of course, that was the first time that had been done. And then that was revolutionary.
So really you're able to track many of the things across the world that exist today right back to John Smeaton in Leeds.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, kind of our research goes on all the time. And actually, even today, kind of, we uncovered a new article today, which was written for an American civil engineering society. And this guy, and the paper it's called A Man for All Reasons. And the premise of it is this, I'll send you the link afterwards, Matt. It's a great article where this man is doing exactly that. He's tracing all of the kind of the history of the Industrial Revolution, kind of, and he even talks about, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, because these were all kind of going on, the three great revolutions going on in the 1800s, in the 1700s, that were all essentially not started by Smeaton, but he's one of those foundation stones, kind of to all of that. And it's like what Abby was saying earlier about the stuff that was then built on the back of what he did. He made water wheels and windmills and wave power and canals more efficient. And then on the back of that, after John Smeaton, that meant mills were more efficient. That, it kind of began to welcome in the Industrial Revolution, not all of which was brilliant, was it? Kind of for lots of different reasons, from whether that's, people and their living conditions, to air pollution, to trade and global trade and migration and colonialism and all of those things. You'd kind of these things that come on after small wheels are started.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But something that I'm always fascinated by when learning about amazing revolutionary tech, in its broadest sense, is what happens down the road with it, and how, especially when things are open source in a way that they are now, like legally open source, or a way that they have been in the past, where things are shared, and technologies are driven and change and develop, that you kind of, at some point, you have absolutely no control over what happens with that. So I find that really interesting when we're thinking about tech for the public good. there's almost a realization that no matter how much of a public good it has, there's only so much control you have over that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that there's a question when we talk about the public good, it's like, for whose good? I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think Smeaton definitely, he was interested in making, his goal was to make the world a better place, but at the same time, he was a man of that time as well. And he was a man of that time. He was a white man of that time. His interests were kind of reflected the world around him, and kind of his experiences as a man who had grown up with not excessive privilege, but he definitely grew up with privileges in that he had access to a good education and food on the table and all of that kind of thing, and a support network of other men as well, sharing their manly knowledge with him. So I think everything has, when you think about tech for the public good, it's always with that kind of knowledge that it is reflective of the time that it's being kind of developed within, just as it is right now. And just as when you think about the birth of the internet and what was that kind of, what were the original intentions of that? There's no way that Tim Berners-Lee intended for some of the really terrible things that happen through technology. That wasn't his driving ambition. It was quite the opposite. And I think it is always fascinating. I think that there will always be that element, though, won't there, where you kind of create something with the best of intentions, with the best will in the world, but then somebody else will come along and do something with it that's the complete opposite of kind of how you'd imagined it. Or the other thing is that people will then look back on it and go, actually, you say that was for the public good, but for whose good was it actually? You could look at Smeaton and go, he did think the whole thing around him not patenting his work meant that he wasn't kind of feeding the beginnings of capitalism, but at the same time, the work that he did feed the beginnings of capitalism, because it was about the movement of goods, it was about the movement of people, it enabled global travel, and all of that kind of went on with it. And God, I wish we had a time machine. I wish we could bring him into this podcast, and I wish we could talk to him and say, okay, so what do you think? What do you think about the Industrial Revolution, John?
I think there were some interesting things as well that he did around the kind of ethics of employment as well, kind of, that actually probably were a bit ahead of their time, really. I mean, when Abby and I first started, researching John Smeaton, the first thing that we did kind of years ago was, we started to kind of go, right, who is this man, because, they're not all that great, are they, from the 1700s, kind of. And actually, it was quite good to see that actually he had some really interestingly ethical employment practices. So he wasn't a minimum wage payer. He paid, over and above the kind of minimum wages that were around at the time, because he wanted a workforce that wanted to work, and because he knew some of the work was hard work, kind of. And he was well known for being on site and doing the most difficult jobs himself, kind of. He instigated sick pay for his workers. Well, that was unheard of in the 1700s, kind of. The workers on the Eddystone Light were so valued that at the time, because we were at war with France at the time, and at the time, what happened was there was a special coin minted that his workers carried when they were out, when they weren't at work. They carried this special coin that basically was the get out of jail free coin if they got press ganged, to kind of go and fight. And I read another lovely thing today, which was the King of France at the time. Once the Edison light had been built, and we were still at war with France, the King of France, a ship kidnapped the lighthouse keepers kind of and took them back to France. And the King of France apparently kind of went, well, we may be at war, but that's not on. And he released the lighthouse keepers back to the lighthouse. But he also kind of drew up a management structure that is still used today. So Abby had found this kind of fantastic, the setting out of who the engineers are on site, kind of, and that's still used 300 years later. So some of those things are still relevant today, but it was great. A little punch in the air moment when we realized that he wasn't a kind of minimum wage beating his workforce kind of, that actually, if anything, he was a bit the opposite. I think his foreman, he took on his son as an apprentice when his foreman died, and kind of basically educated his foreman's son, who then became a kind of prominent engineer in his own right, called William Jessup.
So I feel like I'm just throwing this at you, but who would you say are the modern day equivalent?
Oh, yes.
Well, not Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting to draw parallels, I guess, with what you were saying about how he was quite well renowned enough to have people approaching him from across the world, offering him work, but maybe not so well known enough that he was like patenting everything and making it all about him. So perhaps the people that would be the modern day equivalent are the people that aren't as well known.
That's a very, very astute point, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We'll do our homework on it, and we'll come back to you on that, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's good. So throughout your couple of years of research into John Smeaton, that started out with researching into lighthouses, if you were to get the people of Leeds to know a little bit more about John Smeaton, would you prefer people to have a history lesson, or would you prefer people to have the ability to maybe learn and experiment and develop their own skills, or a bit of
definitely the second one.
Definitely the second one.
And actually you can do both of those things as well. I think history is amazing if you can bring it to life, if you can make it relevant, and the way that you make it relevant and bring it to life is by getting people doing stuff. And that is the beauty of the work that he did. It was all about doing stuff. It was all about making things. It was all about problem solving. And so if we could have anything that was going to kind of make everybody excited about the work that John Smeaton did, it would be through doing. And I think rather than kind of going, this is what he did, I think it's more about us going, this is what it means for today. It tells us something about Leeds as a city. It tells us something about our kind of place in history, and there's good bits to that, and there's really difficult bits to that as well. But then it's also about us going, what are our big issues in the city today? How can we apply some of that way of working, that collaboration, and that whole kind of pooling of ideas, and not being afraid to kind of fail and not get everything right the first time. That would be the best way for us to do it.
Yeah. And it's that thing, Matt, of what you just said, your last question of kind of, who's John Smeaton today? It's who are the next Johns, Janes, Josiahs, who are all the next Smeatons kind of, and making sure that, they get to tackle those issues. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really touched on, which kind of is the fact that, so John Smeaton, he won something called the Copley Medal, which is the most famous kind of science medal that you can win, basically. And so other holders of the Copley Medal are Einstein, kind of Stephen Hawking would be a new kind of modern name type thing, and John Smeaton. Remember, let's go back to the fact that what did Leeds do? We named a flyover after him, kind of. But but he won the Copley Medal not for building the Edison light, but he actually won it for the work that he did on wind and wave power. He won it for renewable energy, kind of, and this was in the 300 years ago. And so, because that was the power source at its time. And since then, we've dug up fossil fuels, we've invented nuclear power, and all the joys that those things bring, kind of. And what are we doing right now? We're needing, understandably, to go back to those older sources of power. And so if John Smeaton was here today, he was 300 years ahead in renewable technology. He'd be working on that. He'd be working on tech. He'd be working on broadcasting, on everything. So I think there is still relevance of his work today, but absolutely, I think your question of a backwards looking project or a forwards looking project, if it had to be one or the other, and I think Abby's right, there's elements, there's a way of doing both. We choose forward looking every time.
Thinking about your research into John Smeaton, if there was one thing that you found that you think very few people know about and that you wanted to share, something that you haven't already shared today, what would that be?
Okay, so the most secret thing that I have found, and there's no reference to it that I can find on the internet, I found it in a dusty book in the library in Leeds. And that is that when the Eddystone Light, okay, there was 3 versions of the Eddystone Light. Well, actually, there's a 4th now. So 2 fell down for various reasons, which is another podcast. Kind of, John Smeaton built his Eddystone Light. And then it served brilliantly for decades. And then they discovered that the rocks underneath the Eddystone Light were hollow. And they became concerned that the lighthouse might fall, not because there was anything wrong with the construction of the lighthouse, but basically because the reef underneath might break up. And so, but it was so loved, was the Eddystone Light, that the people of Plymouth, by public subscription, wanted for it to be dismantled stone by stone and brought back on shore to Plymouth. And then they were going to build a new one next to it. The fact that I found out through a small book called The History of Whitkirk Church, which can be found in the Family History Library in Leeds, I don't think there's probably many copies of this book that have been written, is that at the time, the people of Leeds wanted it to come to Leeds, and they had it costed up to see whether they could afford for actually the lighthouse to come home. And that is something that is very rarely known and isn't on the internet.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us today. It's been really interesting to hear more about your research. For me, one of the most exciting things about learning more about the history is that it can inspire people to make new things, and we can think about how they'll be making things that might have impacts for hundreds of years to come.
Yeah, and how they might collaborate.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this. Is there anything closing you'd like to say?
I think if anybody wants to get in touch with us, we'd love, in the spirit of John Smeaton, to hear ideas, hear what you think, collaborate with you. So yeah, get in touch with us, and yeah, be great to see what we can come up with.
Thanks. Do you have a contact email, a Twitter or something like that you'd want people to contact you through?
Yeah, you can get in touch with us on Twitter at We Are FOXGLOVE. That's probably the best way to do it. And
Right.
Yeah, it'd be great to hear from people.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you for today. It's been really interesting chat, and look forward to hearing more about your research in the future.
Thanks, Matt.
Cheers, Matt.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you'd like to learn more about Leeds 2023, visit leeds2023.co.uk or Leeds_2023 on Twitter. Thank you. Bye.